it's all the information will be here. These slides will be made available to you all after the event. I've also provided some materials. There are 3 handouts here, and I'll be referring to these today. These are research bulletins. When I conduct research projects, I tend to generate these bulletins as a means of disseminating the research findings in a way which is clear to a broad audience. And I have to say that although this has been my habit, it became particularly important during the COVID years. There was 2 years when we couldn't interact with people, and it was very handy then to have all of these in PDFs, and you could send them off to colleagues and people in this industry, etc. So these have come in very handy, and I'll be referring to these. And these are a resource for your activities today and also the work you'll be doing tomorrow. Okay, let's start then. So this is a background for stuff that you know, and it's been well stated. My understanding is that that you've been offering work integrated education programs since 1979, and this is one of the largest offerings within India. And it wouldn't surprise me, by the way, if it's one of the largest offerings across the planet. I'm not aware of too many universities with the number of students that you have involved in work integrated education programs. These programs, particularly the main programs you offer to people in working life, as Professor Sandra was saying, offered for working professionals and designed and delivered along those lines. And the idea is for your students to become intentional, active, lifelong learners. You've done a recent review which PB presented at the conference, and it pointed out some issues that need to be addressed. That is managing students' work-life balance, accommodating the different levels of readiness of students to engage in learning in their work settings, and then the diversity of technological challenges that your students face in work settings, and then also the limitations of faculty. Now, I don't think you should see that necessarily as a strong criticism. It's just that as knowledge changes very quickly, and we've seen that enormously with AI, it's very difficult for faculty to be 100% competent for the changing processes that are occurring in enterprises. So this then raises questions about what is the role of the faculty to remain competent, but also to be good educators, to engage in resources. So I don't think you should necessarily see that as saying, because you're not 100% up to date with what is happening in Cyberbad, I guess the expression you use, that shouldn't be seen just as something which is hugely deficit. And the purpose of this workshop has already been stated, I think, is to develop further this unique model you have here of work integrated education, to engage with you as experienced faculty members, and for you to collaborate and interact, and to advance, further develop your model, as Professor Sandra was saying, and also to perhaps help students meet the 4 challenges that they're raised, and to enhance the educational viability of the programs you offer in terms of graduates' learning outcomes. Those requirements are going to constantly change because the working life constantly changes. The requirements of occupations and what is required for effective work will constantly change. So this will be an ongoing challenge. And then the role, perhaps, of supporting innovation and change in work settings, so that although the education provision is often focused upon the individual student, there's also the capacity to influence the communities we work in and the workplaces in which we engage. And so how can these education provisions support innovation and change in work settings? So fundamentally then it's about focusing the BITS model of work integrated education to meet the kind of institutional imperatives that you have and workplaces have, but also your students' needs. The program's got 2 segments to it. Today, one, we're doing introduction to the seminar. I've just changed some stuff around, and we'll be doing some introduction of concepts, key concepts, the worth of work-integrated education, WIL, distinguishing between work-integrated education and work-integrated learning. Then we'll have a focus group activity, and we're probably going to do that for over a working morning tea, where you'll go in your tables and have morning tea and address some questions. That's to make good use of the time, but also to maintain the focus. And then tomorrow, Karsten will take you through that process of then advancing the model you have here. As Professor Sandra was mentioning, we've had this very productive 2 days of engagement with staff here and learning about the research you're doing, the ideas you're generating. And MJ here came up with a very helpful distinction. And that was, he distinguished between the traditional model of WIL, or work-integrated education, and what you have here at BITS. And he made the point, and I think it's a very good point, and this is a point that Karsten and I have been making. It's also a point that the review you're having done by the University of Waterloo have made, and that is the vast majority of focuses of work-integrated education programs are on full-time students, often young people, school leavers in higher education institutions, and then going into places for placements or practicums or clinical experiences, depending upon what discipline they are involved in. And what's perhaps unique about your model is that it's not like that at all. Yes, you have some campus-based students who are having work-integrated learning, but your big program is quite different in that. And I've tried to distinguish that in this table here, building upon what NJ proposed. And that is, for instance, in the traditional model, the kind of research I'll be presenting to you, the kind of the programs which Karsten runs, the kind of programs that occur at University West in Sweden, etc., are about full-time students in tertiary education programs. And when I say tertiary education, I refer to vocational and higher education programs. And then these are full-time students often preparing for working life. They haven't been in the workplace. Some countries, for instance, don't like young people engaging in paid part-time work. I'm from Australia. Most young people have engaged in significant paid part-time work. Most university students engage in paid part-time work. But in Singapore, where I do work, it's frowned upon students engaging in paid part-time work because they're supposed to be concentrating on their studies. So those students, when they leave their polytechnics or the university, have no knowledge of the world of work, how you conduct yourself, your role working with others, etc., etc. And then the primary source of learning for the traditional model is experiences within the education institution. And then the academic curriculum is the key focus of activities. But your students, I wonder if this will work. Your students, yes, there we are. Your students are mature age students in full-time employment, who, by the way, also happen to have family commitments. They often have community commitments, etc., etc. So as well as demanding work life, they often have commitments to your parents or children, parents, and many of your students would be part of communities, religious or social or sporting or whatever. So this is just one of the activities which your working age students engage in. And these are adults who are mostly experienced in working life and are part-time students. And that the primary source of their learning, unsurprisingly, will be in work settings. And that for them, what is referred to as the practice curriculum, that is the way that curriculum occurs for them, is one based in practice, and concepts of pedagogic and personal practices are going to be quite different than your full-time students. And these concepts I'll be visiting later, and they're explained in this particular handout here about all of those things. But don't worry about that now. So I think that's a helpful way, and it was very helpful to have those 2 days of engagement because that gave us insights in how to progress this discussion.
No, so my comment was on the points on the right side along the BITS model. So a couple of things, observations. The way we look at it is they are not necessarily part-time students, but full-time students. That's one comment. And I am not so sure whether the primary source of learning is the workplace. It's probably a combination of the classroom, the academic, because it's a very structured program with a lot of academic it's an educational program. That is the main source. We do blend the workplace and learning experiences, practical experience, and so on. And the last one also, you've written practice curriculum. While definitely a lot of practical experiential learning aspects are there, but nonetheless, it's an rigorous academic curriculum. So I'm not sure. Maybe this is so. That's what I was just talking to.
What I want you to do is suspend those judgments until I've worked through stuff, because what you're articulating are views about learning and education. And that is, if we assume that learning only occurs with intentional educational experiences, we miss a lot. Now, the traditional model of apprenticeship, for instance, the vast majority of that occurs within work settings. So in my country, 84% of the time of an apprentice is spent in the work settings. 16% of the time is spent in an education institution. Now, do we believe for a minute that it's only that 16% of the time that the students learn? Now, later on in the presentation, I'll be showing you PIAC data, which indicates several measures. It indicates the measures of problem solving that occur in work settings, and problem solving is directly associated with learning. I'll be indicating measures of workplace discretion, the degree by which workers are able to exercise their agency in the workplace, which again is a measure of learning. And thirdly, I'll be providing you with data about the way that learning occurs in those work settings that comes from the PIAC data. Now, we don't have the PIAC data from India. We have it from 35 countries. The one I'm going to use is Singapore, because that's one which is as close as I can get for the participating countries. When you look at that data, you will come to the conclusion, I hope, that learning is an inherent part of engaging work activities. The point about the full-time, yes, there might be full-time students, but they've also got these other kinds of commitments. They have the work commitments, the family commitments. And unless we understand that as educators, we're not going to be fully able to accommodate the needs of our students. I refer to these students as being time jealous. And that is, they're not time poor. They have so many commitments made upon their time that they need to work out what they give priority to. And working people engaging in their daily work often have to give priority to the work activities, the imperatives of the workplace of achieving those goals. And that's why it's very important we try and bring together what we're doing in the academic curriculum with what occurs in the practice curriculum, what happens in the work settings. So I'll be elaborating these concepts. Well, what I'll ask you to do is just withhold judgment until I've worked through some of these ideas with you.
It was an observation on how things are going today.
But what you're articulating is what I often hear from educators who tend to privilege the process of teaching and the education provision over people's learning. I work in a faculty of teacher education, and the majority of my colleagues only see rich, worthwhile learning occurring when somebody's teaching, often them, by the way. So what I'm trying to help you understand is we need to think more broadly about learning and what constitutes education. And a big part of the role of educators is how we can organize and support effective learning experiences for our students. So, but I'll ask you just to hold off on that kind of judgment until we work through the presentations. The goals for contemporary work integrated education. And this again features what MG was saying, and that is the key goals for higher education is initial occupational preparation and the ongoing employability of graduates. So that's the traditional, but also probably the BITS approach. But it's also good for assisting students identify the preferred occupations, as I've mentioned. And it's also about developing adaptable occupational and workplace capacities. And that goes through both the traditional and the BITS model, and also developing work-life competencies, which is the traditional and the BITS approach, and then realizing innovations in work settings. And I think that can come very centrally from the whole approach you take. And I think that's one thing that will really engage employers with your students in their workplace, because they're not only interested in change in their students, called their employees, called learners, they're also interested in the way that that learning can assist the viability and further development of the enterprise. It's also important to remember that when we refer to employability as a concept, it is not just about getting a job. It's about sustaining that employment when circumstances change. And then it's also about the ability to perhaps move to other occupations as circumstances change, as industries decline in numbers and occupations change radically. So employability is not just about getting that job. It's about remaining employable across working life. And I guess, as we all know, I think we know, is that unless India is unlike most other countries, working life is getting longer. So in France, they're complaining because they can't retire at 60. In my country, it's like 70, not retirement, but pension entitlement age. I think by the time many of people here progress through their working lives, people will be routinely working until their 80s, I suspect, because of the demographics and the population, particularly countries like China or other countries which have very small fertility rates. I think it's important, I know this is awkward stuff, but I think it's very important we delineate these two concepts of work-integrated education and work-integrated learning, because ontologically they're totally different. Now, the reason I think it's important, and I think it's already too late, by the way, is that I've seen this mistake made over and over again. One of them is that learning through work is often referred to as informal learning, which is a nonsense, because it's suggesting that humans' cognitive and neural and haptic processes, when I'm in a situation like this, are engaged in something called formal. And when I go out in the corridor there, my cognitive and neural other processes engage in something called informal. I mean, it's nonsense. And the other part of the nonsense is that anybody who's spent any time in workplaces know that the access to activities and interactions in workplace are highly structured. They're far from being informal. In the coal mines of central Queensland, where I first did my research in how people learn through work, there was jobs which were highly valued. These are called the drivers of huge cranes. The buckets of the cranes would be about half the size of this room. And these workers were the most highly prestigious workers on the coal mine. Everybody wanted to do that work because it's very well paid. Your cab was air conditioned, but there was a 25-year waiting list to be trained. And the waiting list is determined by your membership of a union, because one union called the FEDFA, the firefighters, the fire union who used to put coal in locomotives, they had priority. And of course, if you engage in healthcare work, you will see the hierarchy of medicine, nursing, and other disciplines. So workplaces are far from informal, they're highly structured. In fact, it's often those structures which inhibit effective learning in work settings. So the other error here is references to lifelong learning. The vast majority of references to lifelong learning you'll see in governmental policy, and sadly the work of academics, is actually about education. It's about the provision, what's happening here, a person standing in front talking to other people. But of course, lifelong learning is something which occurs as we enter this world, and finishes when we cease to be cognate or we physically die. And yet, most of what is captured in terms of lifelong learning is about a taught process. But when you look at how adults learn across their working lives, you find that the vast majority of that learning occurs outside of intentional education experiences. And the great risk when government talk about lifelong learning and what they fund then is things like this, not how people learn and engage in their work practice. So it's probably too late. I know it's difficult because there's now associations of work integrated learning, which call themselves learning. But I think it's important because, as Professor Sundar was saying, we need to be able to understand these concepts scientifically. So these concepts are often conflated, but I think it's important we distinguish between them. So learning is something that people do. You have to be able to drink water to learn. It's something that humans do, change. So learning comprises, in this case, individuals experiencing an integration of experiences in work and educational settings as a personal process of reconciliation and change. It is what is referred to as a personal fact, and that is, its learning is a change brought about by experiencing. How we construe and construct the experiences we've had, and so it's person dependent. That experience I talked about yesterday was an experience I had. I'm sure Karsten had a very different experience. He probably related to some things, but different things. And perhaps Karsten's wife, Lisa, probably had different kinds of experiences. And those of you who are quite familiar with it probably saw things that, oh, that building wasn't there last time I was here. So we all see things and construe and construct things differently and make judgments about what we see. So it's something that we do. So learning, the change that occurs, is a product of having experiences. Now, work integrated education is a mode of education. It comprises the provision of work experiences and intentional efforts to integrate them in educational programs. And this is what Searle refers to as institutional facts. Searle, the philosopher who recently died, he differentiated two kinds of facts. There are institutional facts, those that come from society, and brute facts, those of nature. And what he said is, we can't wish either of them away. So the brute fact of aging, I wish we could wish it away, but unfortunately we can't. We all go through the process of maturation, which unfortunately at the end is not desirable. But anyway, but in terms of institutional facts, he says these are the things which arise from society. So occupations are cultural practices. They exist because society needs them. So we might call them occupations, but they exist because there's a need for them. And when there isn't a need for them, those occupations disappear. I mean, if you look at lots of people's names in the Anglo-Saxon world, you'll find that their names were associated with the work they did. There's lots of smiths out there. But how many smiths are actually, pounding metal? You'll see a very common name is Fletcher. But how many of them are making arrows? You'll see lots of people named Cooper. But how many of them are making barrels? You'll see people called Milner. But how many of them are making hats, etc., etc., etc.? So those occupations, barrel making, by the way, has become more fashionable recently because of the big need for making scotch and having scotch made in barrels, wooden barrels that have been aged through port. So there is some revival, but not mass still. So institutional facts are, we have occupations, we have education institutions. Education institutions are always established for achieving particular kinds of purposes. And so they exist. Sometimes it's religious purposes, sometimes it's governmental purposes, sometimes it's particular specific purposes for a particular sector. So they exist, and essentially education is an intentional provision of experiences to achieve particular kinds of goals. And if you look across human history, you'll see the way that those goals have been shaped and changed over time, and that has changed the kind of institutions that have been put in place, but it also shapes the kind of educational processes that occur. So each of these concepts has a distinct purposes and processes.
So just as a bit of a background, work integrated learning, the term work integrated learning first came up at around the mid-1990s, which I like to think is not that long ago, but that's more than, well, it's about 30 years ago. So I guess it is quite some time ago. When Judy Preddy and I were working on the International Handbook for Work Integrated Learning, we thought we'll do a deep dive into the literature and see if we can find the very first mention of work integrated learning. And the very first mention we could find was in a refereed conference proceeding of a conference that was in South Africa, and it mentioned WIE's mission statement. Now, WIE is the International Association for Work Integrated Learning that hopefully some of you are familiar with. I'm going to talk about it later on because we have a conference coming up, so hopefully people can come to that conference. But they had in their mission statement that they want to be the world leaders in work integrated learning. And that was the first time that we found that being mentioned. And that kind of fits with my thinking. I joined work integrated learning. We didn't call it work integrated learning then about that time. And my director at the time said, oh, the Americans, they've come up with a new term. It's work integrated learning. It's going to be really big. And I thought, oh, yeah, whatever. And here we are. Work integrated learning is that big term. Now, the nice thing about the term is that there are lots of different programs with different names, how to describe the program. I like to refer to it as so many different terms that's even some terms are meaning the same things, other times the same term mean different things. It was all a bit of a dog's breakfast. It was a mess. And work integrated learning as a term came in as an umbrella term. They kind of pull all of that together, but at the same time, it allowed us to create a space where we can talk about similar things. Because all these programs, with different terms, they had similar ideas and similar goals and similar plans of learning outcomes for the students. So it's nice to lump them together. Now, even though the term itself is new, 25, 30 years, the concept of a student, a learner working alongside a practicing professional, that concept is not new at all. That is as old as time itself. I've mentioned cooperative education. Who was familiar with cooperative education? Raise your hand if you've come across that before. One? All right. Well, you should hopefully after this all be able to raise your hands. So cooperative education, it's a North American model. It's to do with students having alternative terms or semester in the workplace where they are workers. So it's a full immersion workplace experience and multiple times. Practice school. Another good example of a different term describing a similar sort of thing. So it's, and again, that sounds very, very similar. And that's, a lot of us will refer to work placements as being cooperative education as well. So cooperative education started in 1906 by Herman Snyder at the University of Cincinnati. And Herman Snyder is often seen as the father of cooperative education. And he brought the cooperative education into the engineering space. So that's something that all of us can relate to. And it became common practice in North America. And interestingly enough, Herman Snyder never said he invented this. He actually borrowed it from the practice in law and in medicine. So already the idea existed prior to that as well. And I'll come back to it later on because there was something that happened with funding and quality that had a big impact on what happened in cooperative education. And that's a bit of a warning for us in the future. Sandwich degrees, who has heard of the sandwich degree in the UK? You're a student graduate. Oh, well done. There we go. Yes, and you did yours in the UK? Oh, from India. Ah, okay, so it comes there as well. So the sandwich degrees is common UK model, obviously in some other places as well. It's a 4-year degree where the 3rd year, the student spends the whole year in the workplace, and then they come back for their 4th year. That almost certainly existed already as early as 1840 in a formal form because it came up in legislation in Parliament. So there's evidence that existed then already. And the modern form of apprenticeship, the current modern form we have, we can trace that back through the guilds all the way to the term, to Imperial Rome, to those bits of times. And again, the whole idea of a newcomer learning from an old timer, an established person, that would have existed since the dawn of time. So perhaps a new term, but the concept is not new at all. So some of the defining elements of work integrated learning and work integrated education across all of these programs, and this will come up multiple times today, is that it is about learning. It is about an educational approach. It's about having students being able to learn in a particular context. It must involve an external partner. It's not just a campus-based activity within a lab that is experiential learning. Work integrated learning is a form of experiential learning, but it's a narrow form. Just to make it confusing, sometimes the external partner can be the university, because the university is complex, does research, and you can have students doing research placement in the university, but the role of the person is no longer an educator. They're actually acting as an employer. They wear a different hat. And students need to do authentic tasks. They have to be real tasks, and they need to be meaningful as well. And there's a particularly important part. So, yeah, are there references within there? There's only one Zegwaard that published this, and you'll see it crop up a couple of times. But and I'll promise you, I have a reference list at the end. So if you want to do some more reading afterwards, there's a good list sitting in there. So to just be warned on that one. So why are we seeing work integrated learning and work integrated education expanding across our higher education sector? Now, if we just generalize and look at the purpose of university in society, it's usually those two roles around education for the betterment of society and then education to increase productivity. And the latter I'll talk about at more length. Now, we know that higher education increases societal knowledge, and it's about building up that ability in that area. And work integrated learning, we know that enhances students' learning experiences and the amount of knowledge they learn, particularly around conceptual knowledge, and then how that is applied in the place of practice. Work integrated learning, highly engaging. It is transformative when it comes to the student, and it develops critical and creative thinkers. Now, critical thinking has always been a big part of university education, but it's really important that we also develop creative thinkers, because creative thinkers are particularly important when it comes to problem solving. Now, the next one, the education to increase productivity. This is what's driving a lot of development and changes that are happening in higher education. We know that work integrated learning enhances the students' employability outcomes. It comes up over and over and over again, and it is the big driver. And governments see that employability or employability outcomes is one of the KPIs of higher education. And that is perhaps more so now than ever before. And the biggest investor in higher education, generally speaking, is the government. And increasingly they see it as an investment. And as an investment, they expect to see a return on investment. And that return on investment is economic development and growth, or in particular, productivity. Now, it doesn't matter what flavor government you have. Actually, it doesn't matter which country you're in. All the governments are wired that particular way. It's all about increasing productivity and growth, especially given our current economic situation. It's a big driver around that. And that's not changing anytime soon. And students also enroll into higher education for the primary reason that they want to have a good career. They want to have a good job. They want to have comfort in life. So they are also employability focused. And I should mention, you'll hear governments talk about employability outcomes from higher education. When they talk about employability outcomes, they're actually talking about employment outcome, which is not quite the same. You would like to think employability will result to employment, that they are different things. But government means employment. And again, they're thinking about that economic growth. And you'll see employability outcomes or very similar wordings as part of the key goals and missions of the university. Now, I actually have not looked up the BITS one, but I'm assuming that some of the primary goals will be similar into that space. In fact, I will come to benefits, but one of the benefits of having students go on to placement is sometimes they discover something they do not want to do. And it's good for them to learn that before they graduate. Yes, yeah. We talked earlier in the week about a student who wanted to be a forensic chemist. We actually got him a placement in the forensic chemistry space in our capital. The student went there for 3 months, came back and said, look, I've learned something really, really valuable. Absolutely hate forensic chemistry. And then subsequently changed direction. But that was at the end of year 2. So he had an opportunity to do that. He actually became an industrial chemist after that.
Yeah, actually the same question which I asked yesterday to Professor Stephen. The first point which you mentioned is increased societal knowledge, where we believe that is as a knowledge society. Like our WILP is operating for more than 46, 47 years now, and more than 1.3 lakh people have already graduated. If we wish to understand what is an impact it had in the society, how we can try measuring it and then try figuring it out, this is an impact of WILP. So that will help us to understand it better.
Yes, yeah, and we're definitely going to come to that. And we mentioned earlier around longitudinal studies and that they're not happening, but there are other ways of measuring impact. So we'll circle around on that. So we're seeing big growth in work and integrated learning in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, US, Asia, pretty much across the world. Sometimes it goes by the term work-based learning as well. I mentioned our university around that. And there's a lot of pressure for higher education to close the gap between higher education and the workplace. Now, BITS has done this amazingly well. Again, this is a unique program where you've really brought that together. Other universities haven't really done that so much as of yet, the more traditional universities. See that as a typo misso. I think it's expanding across the whole world. Some areas perhaps a little bit further behind, and I'm thinking of the Polynesian islands north of New Zealand there's not much happening in that space, but they've always been, if you follow a trend, they've always trended slightly behind, but it's happening in Europe as well, and often it's called work-based learning. I think, Steve, you want to add to that? Stephen's got quite a lot of interaction in the Europe space.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, generally speaking, across tertiary education, that's vocational education, higher education, there's a very strong move for work experiences to be integrated, particularly in initial occupational preparation. And this is about the employability agenda, which is being enacted across many countries. What you'll find, though, it has different manifestations in different countries for historical, cultural reasons, but it's something which is highly consistent across countries in Europe and Scandinavia as well as these ones, yeah.
So just some general words around the future directions, and that is that things around us are changing very quickly, probably more now than ever before. And universities traditionally have been fairly slow to respond to that. And there is a risk that sits within that, as we are still slow to respond, but the world and society is changing faster and faster. So we need to adapt, and we need to look more at learning through doing, more blurring between workplaces and learning. Again, BITS is such a beautiful space to be able to lead into that changing world around us. We need to be looking at students' experiences that prepare them for the future workplace. And here we need to think a little bit about the role that Gen AI has to play within that. And that will impact work integrated learning as well. And then we definitely need to think about that quite carefully, because our students will be using this in the workplace. Again, this will come up later on in an exercise that I've planned for you guys. So I mentioned before, all these different terms used to describe types of work integrated learning practice. It is quite useful to look at work integrated learning that it comes broadly in 2 forms. It comes in work placement form, full immersion into a workplace, which is what we have here and is one of the programs that I run at my own university. And then you've got non-placement forms of work integrated learning.